All right, today we've got Joseph Gum from NCAR, and he's going to give a presentation on data repository um, scorecard on reliability and that sort of thing. So welcome, Joseph, and feel free to get started.
Hi all, thanks for having me. Like Nick said, I'm Joseph Gum from NSF NCAR. I'm the Data Stewardship Coordinator from NCAR, serving as sort of the frontline person, helping people with curating data, making DMPs, all that good stuff. I'm here to present about some work that's been carried out by ESIP's Sustainable Data Management Cluster called the Repository Crisis Scorecards. Some of you may have heard of it already. And so what I have here is our Zenodo page, landing page for now. Right now we're on version 1.02. We just released the first version at the beginning of April. We're hoping to get feedback from everyone that uses this and be able to update the scorecards to a version 2.0 by the July ESIP meeting in Seattle. And to get to the point, the repository crisis scorecards are meant to measure how resilient a repository might be in its normal state and during certain crises. Some of us may have heard of the NASA DAC CDAC at Columbia University suddenly being given a stop work order. And so in the context of trying to preserve data, data sets, trying to figure out what data might be at risk of being lost, we wanted to take a slightly different tack and look at which repositories might actually be more susceptible to suddenly having to cease operations for whatever reason. You can see all of our co-authors and then generally the cluster for everyone that's helped with this so far. And so I'll start. We have an instructions page letter that's here just to help anyone that might be trying to use the scorecards for their own purpose. It'll just give a quick introduction and instructions on how to fill it out. We have 3 parts to this. There's a pre-worksheet meant to help people fill out the scorecards. And we can see this over here. There are some very basic questions, such as what is the total volume of metadata and data? How much bandwidth do you have? How many data sets are you storing that you're the primary archive, repository, data center for? What metadata schemas can you output? And so these questions are meant to set the stage for what your repository might do. And hopefully you can answer all of these questions and be able to know what is going on in your repository. And then after that, we have this repository resilience scorecard. If this looks familiar to you, let me zoom out a little bit to make it a little easier to see. If this looks familiar to you, the format is copied from the model data RCN that was funded by EarthCube to look at archiving, preserving model data. We just copied their format and tried to make something that works here. And so for here, we have a number of different sections, such as single repository dataset replication, repository infrastructure, routine operations, software, so on and so forth. There are 3 categories. We ask that you try to figure out where you think your repository fits. as best as possible, and then put in a number between 1, 2, and 3 to score. And much like the model data RCN rubric, if there's a weight for more importance, it'll change the score accordingly. Eventually, all of this will be tabulated up, and then given values at the bottom, you can see what the total weighted score is. You can see the breakdown by different sections to have a sense of how good you might be doing. All of these scores are essentially broken into 3. And the scores right now are dimensionless numbers. Just the higher a score you have, the better. We're still trying to figure out if there is some meaning, something more we can derive and the only way to really do that is by gathering more data. So we're hoping that people can return their scorecards to us afterwards, and then we can spend the months of May and June to look at people's results and be able to give a better understanding of what we've seen. Finally, we have these scenarios on the top right side. These scenarios are some scenarios that we came up with about what might happen if said disaster, said crisis scenario were to happen. So for the first scenario, a natural disaster hits in less than 48 hours, say Hurricane Helene hitting NCEI, or a wildfire in Australia or outside of LA. That would be an example of a scenario that might happen in number 1. Scenario number 2, repository defunding by the parent organization or primary funder. Then we move on to cyber attacks, cybercrime, or generally some loss of control over cyber infrastructure. And then finally, loss of technical expertise, whether that be due to someone earning and taking a well-needed retirement, or say if it's combined with something like the natural disaster, if someone was hurt during a hurricane or wildfire and they could no longer do their jobs at the time. And so in order to adjust the weighting for these scenarios, what we tried to do was to pose a yes or no question that could be asked. And if the question would be answered no, we would put in a 0 for that. So say for this first question, total number of logical copies, could any logical copies survive the crisis? If the repository itself was defunded and everything was to go away, then there would be no logical copies that would be left. Whereas, if someone was to retire, but the repository was still running, you would still have a score. You would still have copies there, and so you'd still have points there. And so all of these numbers are tabulated up, and again, you can see roughly what the total weighted score might be for each of these scenarios, and it gives you a sense of what the minimum and maximum possible scores are at the bottom. Finally, and we have slightly longer descriptions of each of the scenarios that might happen. And then we have this data impact and recovery scorecard. And so for the data impact recovery scorecard, these are questions that we found to be invariant sort of to the crises, whether or not there's a natural disaster that's about to hit your data facility or people are about to retire. It doesn't really affect if there's a data management plan that's associated with a data set, or how complete the metadata is, or fair compliance. So these questions sort of got broken out into their own section, and it's there to help people figure out, like how much of these are you doing? Do you think you're doing well or not? And then we have this section on impact, which is sort of about societal impact, about say, can warnings be issued to the public or other places, other people about say if your data is being used for forecasting tsunamis or storms, extreme weather, can other people still get access to your data for repositories that may be a part of a federated network? Are there other repositories that are serving as a copy of the data that you're holding so that even if one node of a federated network goes down, the data is still generally available through the rest of the network? Is your repository able to host data for other people, other repositories? Is that a possibility? And so there's this section over here that allows you to get there. And then finally, we have this sheet, this final sheet that's really just for scorekeeping and cleaning up math. Try to make sure that all the formulas work correctly. But what I will point out is that we do have this scenario combinatorics. So for all of the different combinations, you can come up to deal with these scenarios. There's a way to sum up the scores and see what might happen. So say scenarios 1 and 4, where you have a natural disaster that comes in, and also that natural disaster happens to cause people to get hurt, that this will tell you what the total score is that you have. Again, it's sort of a dimensionless number. We don't really know even where the boundaries should be set. If the scoring should be more on a bell curve or percentile, it's very arbitrary where the lines are. There's also scenario 2 and 3 where say CDAC was defunded and then given a stop work order, and then the stop work order sort of froze any sort of action happening. You can still read from there, but it's only a matter of time until some software or some hardware breaks, and then nobody can access it afterwards. So if you really wanted to be really unhappy, let's say, you could look at all of the scenarios and how good you might do in some combination of the 4 different crisis scenarios that we have out right now. And so finally, like I said, we've finished the first version of the scorecards at the beginning of the month. For April and May, we're hoping for the scorecards to get out. We would really appreciate if anyone that finishes the scorecards can either email it back to us or use this form to send us their scorecards and so we can take a look at it and make sure that all of this sort of makes sense. I can show you that we actually have a couple of responses right now from some people that very graciously decided to help in filling this out while we're still developing it. And for one repository, 2 different people filled it out and they have very different scores. We had one that thought they were generally doing well, another one that thought they were doing not as well, which was a little surprising to me. I thought the staff of a repository data facility would generally have the same perception, and the fact that their scores are almost 30 points apart was very surprising to me. So I would strongly suggest to have different members of or all the staff of a data facility, repository, archive try to fill this out, and for groups to generally compare the results and discuss amongst themselves, look, what is happening? Why are there any discrepancies, or what do we think we can improve? Yeah, and I will stop there. Any questions?
Thanks, Joseph. So what were data repository? Do you see this as mainly a self reflection type of survey that helps people understand their own repository, or what's your main like purpose or goal here?
The original purpose was to help groups like PEDP and EDGI that are trying to archive data sets, trying to help them figure out where they should point their attention towards. So sort of a triage tool, for my repository at NCAR, we hold many petabytes of data. It's not possible for a lot of people to simply download all those petabytes of data
Right.
and store it indefinitely. The same for NASA, the same for NOAA. It's just, even if you wanted to, the bandwidth isn't there to do that.
Right.
So can we sort of prioritize at a repository level if, we can say maybe NCEI might last a little bit longer just because of its visibility and importance, if they start going after smaller ones first and eventually turning up the heat. Which data facilities, data centers, since we know NCEI is serving as the archive for a number of repositories, data facilities, data centers, like, how can we triage?
Right.
Along the way, it's grown into this, like you said, self-reflection tool just for the repositories to have conversations among themselves about what it could possibly do better, if there's something that is concerning. I think we've had something along the lines of 20 to 25 people that have had input,
Oh,
both from within the US, outside the US, representing different repositories in the earth sciences, geosciences community. While it is created as a part of ESIP, it's meant to be general enough that, groups in life sciences and other disciplines, even institutional libraries, would be able to use it to assess their own strengths, weaknesses, needs. To use examples we might all be familiar with, if are you using your own organically grown proprietary stack that your institution has been running for, a few decades now? Are you using something that's community developed? Metacat, OpenDAP, ERDAP, other systems, and Venio, something that if you lost your staff members, at least somebody might be around to continue to add features or security
right.
fixes. That's sort of where we're going. We
Okay.
are very interested in getting feedback from people so that we know where to go next with it. If we have either questions or comments from people that are saying, I'd really like to focus on this, or I think the score should be adjusted this way or that way, we're quite happy to do that. We wanted to get the tool out as soon as possible, so we just published the spreadsheet essentially, but we are planning to have a paper published, or at least drafted and pre-printed by the end of the year.
Okay.
And there are ideas for more papers to follow up afterwards.
Great. Rob, do you have a question?
Yes, thanks for this presentation. I've had it earmarked to actually try out the spreadsheet, and since you've done a walkthrough, it looks really comprehensive. and it touches on a number of different areas. What it seemed to me like is the biggest value in this is a lot of organizations are now figuring out they need to filling out a risk register for various kinds of scenarios that affect their organization. Do you feel that this puts a special emphasis on not just addressing the risk of the preservation of the organization, but preservation of the data, even if the organization were to falter, that the
Yes.
data is paramount?
Yes. One of the purposes is for, even if the organization is to falter, the mission of that organization can be continued on. And so I would say the data impact and recovery scorecard, the third sheet that had nothing to do with crises, that is something that can help with generally determining that. The first one is very much so focused about issues relating to the repository as an organization in and of itself. There are some sections in there about continuity agreements. So do you have agreements with other institutions that could possibly mirror some or all of your data? For us at NCAR, we've been talking to CU Boulder as our local peer copy, and then I believe we've been talking to somebody in Germany to serve as an international copy, and that hasn't. This is just something that started this year in the last couple of months.
Yeah.
And so hopefully some of these questions will prompt that sort of, we're asking these questions, we see we have a really low score in this section or another section, and what can we do to improve that score? Well, we need to start talking to other repositories. We have our proprietary tools. They aren't open sourced right now. So if our website was to go down, nobody could get access to the tools. It'd be a lot harder, take a lot more time to read our metadata, or to understand the schema of the XML. We've just been putting it off, but maybe we should go and put it on GitHub or somewhere else now just to make sure that it's out there, and that'll improve the score by a few points.
Yeah, I think it's so hard to get organizations to put time and money on resilience when they're always trying to break new frontiers or address stakeholder demands for new stuff. And it's too easy for things to be left kind of on shaky ground in terms of its ability to continue for years or decades beyond, when it got started. So it's really good to bring these questions up. Matt?
It's a great point, but I would frame it a little differently and say that funding incentives drive you to chase the new stuff and not we never get funded for reliability and stability. We only ever get funded for new features and user-facing visible changes. I think the funding landscape is what drives the whole story here.
Yeah.
I agree, Matt.
It's not, repositories would love to focus more on reliability and stability, right? It's just hard to just get that as part of a proposal of any sort.
You almost kind of have to sneak it in.
Yeah. Well, as the saying goes, never waste a good crisis. And now it's a perfect time to use a good crisis to try to focus on some of these issues that we know we have. I've heard from other people, from Raina Jenkins, that with Core Trust Seal guidelines coming up for renewal for 2026 through 2028, they will eventually have their public comment period. And wouldn't it be nice if the scorecards could be included as sort of a tool for evaluation? They already have, I think, I forget the exact points, but it's like point 15 and point 16. It's pretty far down on the list about data migration and public policies and what are you going to do in case these things happen. You know, and it's sort of whether or not the reviewer will pass you. You can say whatever you want there. This provides a tool and sort of a more structured, standardized way to maybe qualitatively figure out where different repositories stand. If we were able to get results back from people, looking at Zenodo, there's something like almost 500 downloads already and more than 500 views. The only responses I've gotten back are from people I've personally asked to fill it out either before we released version 1.0 or shortly after we released version 1.0. That comes out to about 5 responses, or 6 if I include myself. So, and I've talked to
I've been wanting to do it. I've been wanting to do it, so you can sign me up. Like, I actually did try on an earlier version, and I had so many questions about how to answer the questions that I got stymied. But yeah, I think that's the biggest thing is like what you were showing about variability among, say, different people for the same repository. I think is the key to making it probably rewarding. Is like figuring out how to make the questions unambiguous, and like I suspect there's still probably a lot of built-in assumptions around like how data systems are structured, that those questions like don't fit perfectly, and then therefore somebody has to like figure out how they're going to apply their situation to the question. Like, so yeah, I noticed a bunch of things in here. Like, I've looked over it a bunch of times as you've been going through, and there are a number of areas in here where the question assumes something that isn't true for our scenario. Like, the entire premise of the question is like off kilter. Like,
right,
so
you
it's
need a not applicable response, and that could get some feedback on the survey too, maybe.
Well, no, like the class 1, it's most often like I think the descriptor itself applies, but the way you built the classification of class 1, class 2, class 3 is like orthogonal to the way in which we might be able to answer that question. Like, yeah.
Happy to talk with anybody and sit down with them as they fill it out. You know, and at least give my thoughts on like where we came from. I don't know if that would be helpful or not, or if it would just pollute, bias your responses in one way or another. And I certainly don't want to bias any responses you might have. But yeah, like we're hoping to get as much feedback. We're hoping to release a version 2 by ESIP, and then we're hoping to release a version 3 by AGU. So we're looking for very fast turnaround, especially with just the state of things in the US today. Who knows which of us will be given a stop work order or have our funding pulled next. And so that's why we're aiming to get as much feedback and response and just iterate very quickly. This is the project for the Sustainable Data Management Cluster this year.
Yep. Go ahead, Karen. I have another question too, but go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that Raina Jenkins and her group led for the AI readiness checklist, which is a similar sort of tool that data repositories could lead, was they organized a little cohort to kind of go through it together. And that was kind of nice because sort of on my side, it gave me a timeline. We all have a lot of things that it would be good to do, and it's hard to get down on that list. So it sort of put a timeline around it. It also gave us some hand holding, so we didn't spend quite as long sort of trying to figure things out on our own. And it did kind of lead to a cohesive set of feedback. So, you know, we talked in a group about this one made sense to me. Oh yeah, that didn't make sense to me either. Or, you know, for my kind of data, it doesn't work. Or what if it's not geospatial? So just a thought that seemed like kind of a useful process for that checklist.
Yeah, certainly, that's maybe something we could do as something between now and July. At least with this session that I have in already for July ESIP, we are planning to have like 15 or 20 minutes at the beginning of this session to have any repositories that show up that haven't filled it out, have that sort of cohort session to walk them through, and then talk about scores and what people find and what feedback is useful, what isn't, what questions are useful, what would they like to see in a future iteration.
So can I ask a question about incentives?
Yeah.
So if you look at your data impact and recovery scorecard matrix and look at rows, say 12 and 13, these are about metadata completeness and fair compliance. So the choices here, are basically like, let's say for metadata completeness, the middle choice, all resources have complete metadata for required fields and some have metadata for optional fields. By the definition of required for most repositories would probably fall into that category. The category 3, which is all resources have complete metadata for required fields and optional fields. I don't know of any repository, let's say, there's 600 fields in EML, there's 400 or 500 fields in ISO 19115, there's, like depending on which metadata standard you use, there's a lot of metadata you could possibly fill out. Much of that is classified as mandatory if applicable, or, there's a lot of if applicable sort of fields in there. Like for certain types of data, like biological taxonomy doesn't apply, but there's a biological taxonomy field. So I would never expect any repository to be able to say, yes, that all resources have both complete, required, and optional metadata fields. Like there should be zero repositories that would truthfully answer that question, because there's going to be at least one field in some metadata standard that they didn't fill out. But the incentive would be for them to be in class 3, right?
Yes.
Like if you're trying to like show your best self, you want to be one of the best repositories on the metadata completeness front. Same thing with fair. There's so many ways of evaluating fair. Everybody says their repository is fair, right? Like, but I know from having done a bunch of quantitative fair assessment across 60 different repositories that there's huge variability in what people provide. So how do you align people answering these questions honestly so that we can do a realistic assessment of where we're at versus the incentives which drive you towards like making your repository look as good as metal, so you're not in the bottom of that heap of repositories that are doing poorly and therefore are most likely to get cut? Like,
yeah, I get where you're coming from. When we borrowed the metadata, the model data RCN rubric, they have a sentence in there, something that says, choose the class that you most closely align with. So we think of it as a scale, like it could easily be between 0 and 100, or 0 and 1, and you choose 0.95 or something. We just used the numbers that they used for class 1, 2, and 3. And they forced people to choose an integer. If anyone, I'll be honest, if anyone puts a 3 for fair compliance or care compliance or an ethical considerations, I would doubt that strongly. I don't think, and there is no standard for fair compliance, much less care compliance. Anyone that says that they're doing 3 is, I don't believe. And I can show the results for the 2 scorecards from the same data facility. One person has a 3 for fair compliance and the other person has a 2 for fair compliance. And so this sort of gets to the idea of, well, have all of your staff fill it out, take 30 minutes or an hour or whatever, and then talk about it afterwards and be like, well, why do you think we are getting a 3 in fair compliance? You think we have over 75%, 80% of the way to fair compliance? What is fair compliance? Like, nobody
Yeah.
can answer that.
Maybe it's not a fair question then.
It's not a fair question, but it's something that most of the people in our community knows, and so it's something
So,
that,
so here's a different question that you could ask about fair. So rather than saying is your repository fair or are your data sets fair, you could say, for example, do you have an automated assessment framework for assessing the fairness of your data sets, right?
Arctic Data Center would have a 3.
Right, but that doesn't necessarily say how good our data sets are on the FAIR score. It just says, as a repository, are we building around, you know, automation for these things so that we can quantify them, right? Yeah, I don't know. It's a different question than saying like, yeah. And I think we can spend a lot of time talking about each individual row of this thing, because I think there are a lot of like good efforts going on along that should get credit for the things they're doing, you know, that in terms of like, yeah, there's lots of great activities. The reason I asked the incentives question was like, if we want to use this as a tool for trying to figure out how to both help individual repositories and to work together better as a network so that we can help each other, then we need we need reasonably accurate assessments. But I think the incentives drive you the other way. And so I was just trying to figure out how we get around that, like, because regardless of how good the question is, people are going to want to be on that class 3 end of things. Like, for anything that's visible to their funders, say, right? So same thing with, I found this was one of the things that was super frustrating with me with, you know, CoreTrust Seal, is that like the evaluation process there is super arbitrary. Like, I went through it for several different repositories, and it's so variable based on which reviewer you get, and some of them like are nitpickers on specific things, and it's basically how good you are at massaging your application determines whether you get through it. It's not really I don't personally think CoreTrust Seal does a very good job at identifying trustworthy repositories. I think it's more or less an effort, and it's a great process in terms of like, I think they're all good things to think about. I think the results, when you look at the list, is not very representative of which repositories are doing the best job at being, you know, long-term reliable. So, and it's because it's super hard. Your incentive is to get CoreTrust Seal certified. Like, no repository wants to let them low on that scale, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, we're coming up near the end. Rob, do you have a quick question? I wanted to talk a little bit about what ESIP might be doing, or what we might be doing at the ESIP summer meeting. And
just a quick follow-up. You know, Matt really got into the crux of how this gets used and how it gets presented and what are the implications of how things get scored. And I think this would be at the outset the most useful if people treated it as an honest internal assessment of how they feel about things, to use it as a guide for their own decision making, and identifying serious gaps in preparedness, because like Matt says, as soon as you make it so it's something that is either advertised or your certification hinges on how you score things, suddenly bias enters into it, and you know, gamesmanship and wordsmithing enters into it. And so it no longer becomes a useful and honest tool of scoring, because everybody's going to try to get the high score.
Yes. I completely agree. When we are, I think I have a line in the instructions, but any results that we receive would be kept confidential and kept anonymized and presented in the aggregate when we would present any sort of results. We have no intention of identifying who filled it out. In the scorecard, there is there are sections there for repository name, repository parent organization, date, and project. The project being most relevant for, say, the example we used was NSIDC, NSIDC holds data for both NASA and NOAA, so you could have slightly different variations, and then they also hold data for ELOCA, which is wildly different from the data that they would hold for NASA or NOAA. So it doesn't make sense to treat it as one repository score for all of them when NASA isn't going to replicate ELOCA data. Maybe you have another DAC or NASA headquarters that is replicating ELOCA data. That's replicating other DACs, but not the ELOCA data. And the data impact and recovery scorecard was kind of, we have all these questions that everybody thought were important, but we don't know where to put them and they don't really fit well. The primary focus was on the repository resilience scorecard, and then we sort of massaged our way to make the data impact and recovery scorecard. I would certainly say that the DERS part needs to be thought about again. It needs more focus. I'm reasonably confident in how the repository resilience scorecard turned out. You know, there's some questions about like, how is your physical infrastructure going to do? Do you have diesel generators on site that'll continue to provide power? Like, I think that's a pretty objective measurement statement you can say. But the statement about fair or care completeness, like, no.
I mean, how important is your data repository to be online, real time, all the time? That's also, you know, some are the ones, you know, the ones I'm involved with are more scientific and long term, and so it's not like real time weather or any kind of critical impact for being down for a week or whatever.
Yep.
All right. I think we can stop the recording.